Hello, welcome to day 4 of Unit 3, Revolutionary Actions. Today's topic is the French Revolution. The French Revolution begins. This is part of the broader unit of revolutionary actions, which covers the US Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. This portion, which is actually days 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the unit, covers the beginning of the revolution, the violent eruption in the middle, the Reign of Terror, and Napoleon's empire. Question number 1. What were the major problems with the Ancien Regime? Ancien Regime means ancient government or old government. What were the major problems with the old government? Well, the biggest problem was the class structure of 3 estates. In the old regime of France, which lasted for about 300 years, from the 1400s through the 1700s, was headed by the king. And then beneath the king were 3 estates. The first estate made up of the clergy, the second estate made up of the nobles, and the third estate made up of everyone else. These estates were inherited. Estate as in inherited position, a thing that you inherit from your parents. If you were a member of the third estate, it was because your parents were a member of the third estate. The third estate were all of the people who did the regular jobs, the middle class, the peasants, the city workers, 97% of the people. The second estate were the nobles, and these were also inherited positions. In order to become a noble, you most likely had parents who were nobles. They made up 2% of the population, and you can see this by this graph here. The third estate is almost everyone. The second estate is 2%, and then 1% is the first estate, the clergy. The clergy are members of the church, church leadership, priests, bishops, etc. Your position in each of these estates determined your status in France. The second estate, nobles, had certain privileges, things like taxation that they were exempt from, and also, in a very real practical sense, they were above the law in many cases. In their local districts, they were pretty much able to determine the laws for themselves. The third estate, however, was 80% peasants. The vast majority of French people were peasants working on farms, living a pretty hand-to-mouth struggle of a life. They shouldered the burden of taxation and tithes to the church. In fact, taxes and tithes together made up 50% of the income that they made. It's also important to remember that some members of the third estate were members of the middle class and were workers in cities. Some middle class members of the Ancien Regime were able to purchase positions as nobles, especially in the 1700s, as the king was looking for ways to make money. But largely, your position in each of these estates was cemented by your birth. Number 2, how did the events of 1750 to 1789 lead France to a crisis? France had had the Ancien Regime for nearly 400 years and had not had a crisis of the type that happened in 1789. But 3 big things happened that led to the crisis of 1789. 2 of them were wars. The 7 Years' War that started in America between France and Britain and expanded to the entire world put France deeply in debt. France spent somewhere around the neighborhood of 1.5 billion livres, which is maybe $18 to $20 billion in today's money, depending on how you figure it. They also spent billions on the war in America. The American colonies of Britain declared independence, and France looked for an opportunity to make Britain look silly, spent a lot of their own money fighting the British there. These 2 wars led to a tremendous amount of debt, and King Louis XVI was not able to manage that. In fact, by the 1780s, most of France's annual budget went to paying just the interest on that debt. There were also a number of other economic problems that led to the French economic crisis and France's declining credit rating in the world. But the major thing that tipped the balance was a series of bad harvests. In the 1788-1789 seasons, there was a drought, there was unseasonably cool weather, and this led to bad harvests for the agricultural workers, which, as you recall, make up 80% of France, and it led to widespread famine and, in fact, starvation. These factors led to unrest, unhappiness, and it also led the king to look for solutions to his problems. Why did the Estates General meet in 1789? The short answer is because the king said so. Here's King Louis XVI, and he was in crisis. His major crisis was financial. As we know, he was in a tremendous amount of debt, and as the king, as the sovereign of the country, it was his job to figure out a solution. He was not a very decisive person. He was kind of a wimpy personality, and he would much prefer to do some of his solitary hobbies than to lead the country. He waited for way too long to try to solve the debt crisis, and eventually he needed to call together the Estates General. The Estates General is a general meeting of representatives of the three estates. It was not called very regularly. The last time it had been called was over 100 years previous. And the reason he had to call them was because he wanted to tax the nobles. In order to change the laws, especially on something like taxation that would violate the nobles' customary privilege of not paying taxes, he needed to get agreement from representatives of all three estates. In this meeting hall, the king sat up here on this balcony under the little canopy. On his right was the clergy, the first estate. On his left was the nobles, the second estate. And out here was the third estate. They were largely not given chairs to sit in. They were required to wear all black. They were welcomed into the Estates General last, being forced to wait in the rain while the king greeted members of the first and second estate as they came in. This meeting led to a lot of ill feelings between the third estate and the other members of the Estates General because each estate got one vote. They worked together to negotiate and to debate, and the king asked, should the nobles be taxed? And the third estate said yes, and the second estate said no, and the clergy sided with the second estate to say no. The Estates General met in order to solve the financial crisis, but the first vote did not go very well. Oh, also fun fact, America's friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, was a member of the second estate. He was present at the Estates General. How did Enlightenment ideas lead to the creation of the National Assembly? So the Estates General was kind of a failure, but the financial crisis was real and needed a solution. The three estates continued to meet separately in different rooms at Versailles, at the King's Palace, and the third estate met here, as you can see, in a beautiful room. Here's a member of the third estate in his required head-to-toe black attire. And the third estate met separately for several weeks, becoming increasingly upset at the unfairness of the three estates, general estates system. And well-educated group of men, many of whom were lawyers and other highly educated and worldly men, they started to realize that they represented 97% of the people. And so they, in fact, should have more power than the other two estates. And really, applying Enlightenment ideas of the consent of the governed and other principles that they learned from Rousseau and Locke and Hobbes and all these other thinkers. And they declared themselves to be, in fact, the leaders of the country. In fact, they are France, and the other two estates and the king are extraneous. They declared themselves to be the true government of France. They declared themselves to be the National Assembly. They invited the nobles and the clergy to join them as the one true government of actual France. And our pal, the Marquis de Lafayette, was one of the first nobles to join them. In fact, he was welcomed with open arms, and he was voted vice president of the National Assembly. Number 5, what was the tennis court oath? Well, the Third Estate, or National Assembly, continued to meet in order to write a new constitution, a new document to govern their new government. But one day, when they arrived at their meeting room, they found the doors were locked. The king had locked them out. King Louis had erroneously, mistakenly, thought that by locking them out, he would be able to put an end to the National Assembly. But this turned out not to be true. They went next door to a different area of the palace, and sometimes it's called an indoor tennis court. In English, we tend to call it a tennis court. It was actually a handball court, but we don't really know what that is, so we just call it a tennis court. And this indoor tennis court, this like indoor gymnasium, was broken into, led the National Assembly, led by a guy named Guillotine, actually. He's a famous inventor. He invented a thing that's going to be important later. They broke into the tennis court and they said, okay, well, we're not going to leave until we come up with a new government. If we leave, the king will lock us out again. We're not going to leave until we come up with a plan. The tennis court oath was this promise. All of the members of the National Assembly took the oath, the promise that we will not leave until we write a new constitution, we create a new government for France. Everyone present, except for notably one person, but that's a separate story, took an oath to support the new government of France. At this point, several more nobles joined, probably out of fear. But the conclusion of this meeting, after many days, was the document known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Marquis de Lafayette helped write it. Thomas Jefferson was in France at the time, and he was meeting privately with many members of the National Assembly, so he had some persuasion, some influence on the document. And the document more or less takes the U.S. Declaration of Independence and takes it one step further. Rather than declare independence from the French government, this document declares that these people actually are the French government and that the king and his nobles are extraneous. It is a declaration of the rights of man that they get from simply being born. So some of my favorite wording here: men are born and remain free and equal in rights. These rights included liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It goes quite a bit further than the Declaration of Independence for the US. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits, except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. And these rights can only be determined by law. Pretty much, you have liberty to do anything that doesn't hurt anyone else. Unless the thing you want to do hurts someone else, you have the right to do it, unless we make a special law prohibiting it. So the tennis court oath was taken on the 20th of June. The members of the National Assembly took the oath and promised to not leave the tennis court until they came up with a new government for France. That is the conclusion of the 5 summaries for today. Submit all your completed summaries to The French Revolution Begins and start reading the assignment for tonight, France Erupts in Violence.